So when we look at the scale of the problem in terms of individual cases, some of you may be old enough to remember Indonesia's President Suharto, who embezzled, this is now the President of the country. President of the country. He's estimated to have embezzled between $15 to $35 billion. He was in office for a long time, so he had a lot of time. President Marcos in the Philippines, Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, and President Abacha in Nigeria may have embezzled up to $5 billion each. I think what you remember most about Marcos was Marcos's wife. But Marcos embezzled a lot of money to buy the shoes. But corruption continues. These are old cases. Abacha was in the 1990s. Marcos, who I met personally, myself, Abacha shook his hand in 1985. These are cases that go back to 1980s and 1990s, but it continues. This month, the president of the United Nations, a fellow called John Ash, who happens to be from Antigua, was arrested by the authorities in New York for corruption. Sitting as the president of the United Nations, a fellow called John Ash, an Antiguan, so one of our Caribbean people, and he was arrested for taking bribes from a Chinese billionaire as he helped him to, the fellow called Ng Lap Seng, to get government contracts, using his position as president of the United Nations. These are presidents, prime ministers, these are people, these are not policemen on the beat, these are not customs officers taking bribes. These are the president of the country, elected by the people. This is the president of the United Nations who's sitting here. This lady, this is this month, these are all this month, right? This lady is from Nigeria. She was a former oil minister under Goodluck Jonathan. According to one of the stories that we have about this lady, somebody in her house found $700 million in notes, cash, in her house. And as the story goes, and I did this presentation to Mr. Bailey and so on, so you can actually Google it and see what the story is, yeah? When this money was found, somebody rattled on her and the story was, and the money was found, and she went to the former president, Goodluck Jonathan, and Mr. Jonathan said to her, well, I'm hearing this story, money found in your house, what are you doing with this money? She said, Mr. President, I'm keeping it for you. and he told her to go away. And she was actually arrested in London within the last 2 weeks. And of course, fever. Everybody knows what's happening with fever. And my countryman down there, Mr. Dcomm, who is probably now the best known Trinidadian. He used to be Dr. Eric Williams, our first Prime Minister, who was an eminent historian and Prime Minister and so on. Now the most famous Trinidadian is Dcomm. And why is he famous? For corruption in an organization which has become identified with corruption. An organization which is simply falling apart. As you know, Jack Warner and several others have been indicted in the United States for corruption, already for money laundering. And for, we talk a little bit about how the United States does some of these things now, because the actual underlying offense of the bribery is very difficult to prove. In the case of Warner, the $10 million which he's supposed to have gotten from South Africa, the South Africans said, well, we gave the money to Mr. Warner in his capacity as president of CONCACAF for the development of football in the CONCACAF region. And they said, yeah, we gave it to him. We don't have bribery, we gave it to him. The only problem is that the $10 million ended up in that Warner's pocket. Okay. So, was it a bribe? I mean, this was before, that money, that $10 million was paid after the World Cups were held in South Africa, not before. Okay, so that's very interesting about that. Mr. Warner, by the way, is also supposed to have gotten, I think, $7 million after Haiti had their earthquake. He was supposed to have gotten $7 million to assist Haiti with their redevelopment, and Haiti has never seen that money. This is Haiti, a poor country, after the earthquake, and the money is unaccounted for by Mr. Warner, who is now in the process of being extradited from Trinidad to face charges in the United States. And our Wall Street bankers, because we can't forget the private sector. The private sector is extremely important. But the thing about the Wall Street bankers is that none of them, well, I've only one story, one of them, or some minor fellows on, right, have been jailed for what went on in Wall Street between 2007 and 2009. Not one. As very interesting about the difference what happens in the public sector and the private sector, and how private sector corruption is in fact pursued and prosecuted and convictions obtained. It's very difficult. Now the institutions, many of the banks involved have been fined, and quite seriously fined, by the authorities in the United States and elsewhere. But the individual bankers have not been held or charged or convicted or jailed. And of course there have been many other private sector corruption scandals. Alex Stanford, who you all know from the Caribbean, the Barclays guys who were rigging LIBOR, and that process is still ongoing now with the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom investigating, and I think they are about to lay charges. Barclays has already decided, the guy from Barclays has already decided in that investigation, which is continuing. Bernie Madoff carried out a Ponzi scheme. The Americans quickly jailed him. Enron, very famous case of Enron, and we'll talk a little bit more about Enron when we talk about whistleblowing later on. Massive fraud on their part against shareholders and investors. WorldCom, telecommunications. In Satyam, which is an Indian company, the fellows who ran Satyam, President of Satyam, committed a $1 billion accounting fraud on investors with the, I want to say, connivance with the auditors, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Let me not say that they knew, but as the auditors of the company, PricewaterhouseCoopers ought to have known about this $1 billion that the Satyam guys did. Volkswagen, very recent, with this is the second scandal of Volkswagen, by the way. This latest scandal here with the diesel emissions is the second scandal involving Volkswagen in the course of the last 15 years. General Motors, the ignition switch problem, so you remember that, right? Where General Motors, for a period of 20 years, hid or concealed the problem with their ignition switches, which were switching on and causing the cars to accelerate, and a number of people died as a result of that. And General Motors knew about the problem and did nothing about it over a period of 20 years. People died. And of course, our friend Lance Armstrong. Not that Lance Armstrong, I mean, doping in sport is a form of corruption, so that when we see things on television, we don't quite know what to believe anymore, right? Except when you say quote, of course, right? who we believe does not take any performance enhancing drugs. But the thing about Lance Armstrong is that he did this over a period of, he won 7 Tour de France, as you know. And while these suspicions were going on, he strenuously denied that he was taking drugs. But most importantly, Armstrong got a lot of money from private corporations for his Live Strong Foundation because he would have testicular cancer and he fought back on it. A lot of people were very sympathetic to Armstrong and so on. And he got a lot of money in terms of his endorsements and promotions as a result of that. And he was doing that in the back of what could only be described as corruption. So, how does corruption occur? Corruption is in fact facilitated, it's facilitated by close personal relationships, including family or ethnic ties, by greed, by weak governance, and this is what we are about here today, about how do we improve governance and so on in our institutions to make corruption less possible. Inadequate legislation, inadequate capacity to enforce legislation. It's all well going to put legislation on the books, but we have to enforce it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Weak enforcement of laws, even where there is capacity, and immorality. And corruption is attracted to large infrastructure projects, airports, highway construction, construction of causeways, oil and gas projects. I don't know why causeways here. And it occurs by bribery, of course, and kickbacks. By bid rigging, which, as you know, is where bid rigging apparently is something that is, well, it happens all the time. It's been around for a long time and has takes different forms. But one form that it takes is where if the state has a number of different contracts that it is engaged in. For example, if I have a school building program, so I know that I'm going to be building 20 schools. I put the schools out to tender. There are 5 contractors who are qualified to bid and who are qualified to build the 20 schools. The 5 contractors get together and they say, on this one, you bid high, before you bid high, I will bid low. On the next one, you bid low, the rest of us will bid high. And they rig the bids so that they share up the contracts that are there. The thing about that is that it is very difficult to discover that, right? Unless you are actually scrutinizing the bids as they come in and you can see a pattern, and then even after that, if you do that, usually the tenders have already been issued, the buildings will be under construction and so on already. Right? So bid rigging is very, very difficult to detect, but it's something that's very complicated. We have a number of different contracts that have been led to the same sort of contractors. Inflated contract sums, or things like inflated invoicing. And we also have to understand what happens to the proceeds of corruption after somebody gets it. So after they get it, what do they do with it? And here is where the money laundering comes in. Because money laundering is now created as an offense, and there's a lot of attention now placed on money laundering. Commercial banks now have to do a lot of work to be able to detect money laundering and to report it to financial intelligence units. So within the last, I would say since the FATF has come into existence, all jurisdictions now have to have a set of procedures, and you must be able to demonstrate to the regulator that as a bank you have those procedures in place to be able to detect money laundering. But money laundering itself involves a number of different steps that the launderer has to go through, because after I've got the money, I have to find some way of making sure that it is not detected, but at the end of the day I am able to get it. And so therefore the first part of that process is called placement, where you take the dirty money and you deposit it into various financial institutions, banks, mutual funds, insurance companies, So in the case of insurance companies, a product like an annuity, for example, is a very good product, and if you have money to launder, you put your money into an annuity because you can get back your annuity anytime you want to say, I'm going to pay, I'm going to give you back my money. Okay. And then you wire transfer those proceeds out of the country because you don't necessarily want to keep the money that you've stolen in the country. And that next step is called layering, where the money is then sent to different kinds of institutions. For example, overseas banks, offshore banks. One of the reasons why offshore banks, offshore financial institutions are coming under tremendous scrutiny now and pressure on the part of the tax countries like the United States and Europe, who feel that they are losing tax revenue from this, and these offshore jurisdictions are facilitating money laundering. So to offshore banks, overseas banks, offshore banks, or to a company, the money may actually go into a company trying to buy shares in a particular company overseas. And then integration, which is where the funds are then used to buy legitimate assets, so that the money having gone into these, having gone through the layering process, I then now go and buy real estate somewhere, I can purchase shares in companies and so on, and the money now has become laundered, effectively laundered. So the key about the whole anti-money laundering industry is about how do we detect some of these things. Some things are fairly straightforward. So for example, in the bank, and say I'm a director of the public bank now and so on. So one set of software that we now putting in or have now put into the bank would be to identify situations where the launderer, in our case, you have to report any deposit that is used to be $60,000, which is about 10,000 US, is now 90,000. So any deposit, you have to fill out a source of funds declaration for that deposit in the bank. So typically what people then want to do is that they will put in amounts which are just under that limit, so you don't have to complete the source of funds declaration. And then you would also put in amounts that you have in different branches of the bank over a period of time. We now have software that is able to identify those kinds of transactions that will allow the bank to flag transactions where the person is putting in money deposits just below the threshold limit or below the threshold limit in different branches over a period of time.
Our society is made up of morals and values. What do we mean by morals and values? Morals are also called principles. Morals are habits with respect to right or wrong conduct. Morality is ultimately a personal compass of right and wrong. Values are standards or ideals. Values are important and lasting beliefs shared by the members of a culture about what is good or bad and desirable or undesirable. Values have major influence on a person's behavior and attitude and serve as broad guidelines in all situations. One important result of morals and values is integrity. Without morals and values, there can be no integrity. The word integrity is much used in our society of late. That is understandable, because integrity is one of the main building blocks of a well-functioning democracy. Without integrity, corruption can take hold of a community. Corruption is defined by Transparency International as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. The gain can be either financial or non-financial. In a worst-case scenario, extreme corruption could lead to poverty and could be the cause of hardship. An impoverished community can quickly turn chaotic and unstable. This scenario should make it clear that the fight against corruption is necessary. More importantly, every one of us, as citizens, must take responsibility for this fight. We should all be concerned about the spread of corruption, which can be compared to a virus capable of crippling government, discrediting public institutions and private corporations, as well as having a devastating impact on the human rights of populations.
Now, what are some of the economic and social effects of this? Justice Swift talked about the rule of law and the importance of the rule of law. Well, corruption undermines the rule of law in our society. It undermines the rule of law. It depletes the national wealth because it moves money. All those guys who did those things, whether it's Suharto or Abacha In fact, there's a big, all these things end up in court, not unexpectedly and so on. So in the case of Abacha, in the Nigerian president, a lot of his money went to Swiss bank accounts. When the later presidents found found out about this and asked the Swiss, say, give us back the money, the Swiss then said, well, we can't just give you back the money, just like that. That's not how these things are done. So there was a very long court case. Eventually, the Swiss authorities actually gave Nigeria back the money, or some of them gave them some of the money back. But they had a process which involved the World Bank to make sure that the money that went back to Nigeria was used for certain kinds of projects and so on and so forth. Right? So it is not easy. This whole question of recovery of stolen assets, which I just pointed out before, the STAR initiative, which involves the United Nations and the World Bank, is an important project in this whole anti-corruption drive. When I have discovered that the money has been laundered and the money is now resting in some Swiss bank account or some account in people over in the United States, right? We'll call that in a second. When to recover that money is a process. And what we need to do in terms of international cooperation is to find ways of facilitating the recovery of stolen assets by politicians. I just mentioned that you probably don't want to put money or to park money in the United States, because the United States, some of you may or may not know, as far as money laundering is concerned, in the case of the United States, if the money passes through a financial institution in the United States, on its way to somewhere else, to Switzerland or to Liechtenstein or to wherever it is and so on, the United States claims jurisdiction over the matter and can extradite you and jail you for that. It doesn't have to stay in the United States. If it passes through the United States, and by the way, the United States banks are the predominant correspondent banks and clearing banks and transactions, everybody. Normal transactions, everybody. So it's very difficult to know where the money is passing, but usually the money passes through the United States, and if it passes through the United States, they will have jurisdiction and they will be able to extradite you and jail you for that offense. And every movement of the money in the United States bank, right, is a separate charge. So we've had two guys in Trinidad, Mrs. Ferguson and Galvin Ramsey, who the United States have been trying to extradite for the better part of 10 years now, with great difficulty. And their charge list, maybe 80-something charges on the list, but of those charges, 80 are wire transactions. So, corruption depletes national wealth. There's a cost of prevention and enforcement. So all of the structures and so on you have to put in place to be able to prevent and to enforce and so on cost money. There's an inefficient use of public resources. Revenues are directed to large-scale projects because it is in the interest of the politicians to have big projects. Because with big projects, it means that there is big money that can be obtained as a result of that, rather than engaging in petty corruption. So the bigger the contract, the easier it is for the politicians to engage in that. It promotes inequality in a society. There's a redistribution of wealth in society from taxpayers, ordinary taxpayers, to people who are corrupt. It damages the fabric of societies, importantly by lowering the trust in our institutions and our trust in the political leadership. But there's an interesting spin on that, because as Justice Wick pointed out, one of the things about Caribbean peoples is that we may have an expectation that our politicians lead. And we may not consider it to be such a big deal, that if a fellow goes into office and does not come out rich, well, then he's a fool. I would hope that those attitudes are in fact beginning to change as we move forward. So what can we do about it? And it's essentially about prevention, pursuing, prosecuting, and punishing. We do have international and regional conventions, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. There are several European similar conventions which are very excellent when you read them, and they urge countries who are signatories to have domestic laws which support the provisions of the conventions. And a lot of countries, in fact, do have legislation which does that. And of course, international cooperation in terms of enforcement. So when corruption occurs and the corrupt politician flees or the money is located offshore and so on, there will be cooperation from these other states and so on to be able to identify those people and to get the money back. Whistleblowing, extremely important. Whistleblowing was responsible for the discovery and the whole Enron thing blowing open. A particular lady whose name I escape me now is the one who told the authorities about what was happening with Enron, the tremendous large-scale fraud that was taking place with the connivance of the auditors, Arthur Anderson, at the time. Procurement, legislation, and ethics training. So we just want to talk a little bit about each one of these. Right? The International Conventions and Regional Cooperation, I already mentioned the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which has essentially 4 pillars: prevention, criminalization and enforcement, international cooperation, and asset recovery. There are similar European initiatives, and then in terms of international corporations, we have the mutual legal assistance treaties, we have extradition, and stolen asset recovery. So I'll talk a little bit about those. Then we have domestic legislation to address corruption, which would involve prevention of corruption, proceeds of crime legislation. Now, more recently, within the last 10 years, we've had financial intelligence and anti-money laundering legislation. We have revised bribery legislation. The United Kingdom has just published, not published in 2010, the United Kingdom had their new bribery act. The United States had, this was under Jimmy Carter, so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States goes back to, I think, 1976, when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, and it came about as a result of the discovery of bribery on the part of the United States multinational corporation in some developing country, and Carter said, no, we're not going to have that, and they instituted the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that has been a model for many other countries since then, that makes it a crime for a United States corporation to offer a bribe anywhere outside of the United States. Not that you can do it in the United States, but it makes it a crime for you to do it outside of the United States. Integrity in public life legislation, whistleblowing legislation, procurement legislation, and of course freedom of information legislation. The anti-money laundering, I've talked a little bit about that before, but it involves knowing your customer. So the banks now need to ensure that they know their customers. So all of us have had to go through the process recently, I'm quite sure here as well, where the banks are asking you to fill out a whole set of new forms, identify who you are. In the case of the FATCA regulations, which is the United States Foreign Asset Tax Compliance legislation, which identifies all US citizens and residents of other countries must be identified by banks in those foreign countries so that they can be taxed by the United States. So FATCA compliance is also part of that know your customer process. It's very tedious and so on, you all have to fill out all these forms, but it is important for the protection obviously of the banks themselves.